And there's really no secret answer out there. It's really just like, let's look at what we're already doing right, which is probably a lot. That's one of the things I get really frustrated with, was how difficult it is for ADHD women to see how amazing they are. And, we've been told we aren't. So it's an uphill battle, but I think it's much easier to see in each other how extraordinary we are.
Welcome to Successful with ADHD. I'm Brooke Schnittman. Let's get started. Today, I am welcomed with my friend Katy Weber, who is an ADHD advocate, coach. She's a podcast host for not only one podcast, but two podcasts. The Woman in ADHD podcast, where I was lucky enough to be a featured guest there, and the ADHD Lounge, which she just started as a co-host. And she was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 45, everyone. She's made it her mission to help neurodivergent brains, especially women, to help them love their brains and overcome overwhelm of a recent ADHD diagnosis so they can create strategies to help them live a more fulfilling, gratifying life. And if ADHD coaching certification's not enough, she's also currently pursuing her MS in clinical mental health counseling, everyone. So warm welcome to Successful with ADHD podcast, Katy. Nice to see you again.
Thank you, Brooke. That was lovely. Yeah, so great to see you.
So great to see you too. And with ADHD, we always have a hard time either picking one decision, one thing, prioritizing what to do first. In your life, you have lots of multiples. So tell us about, obviously you got diagnosed at 45. We're going to go a little backwards because I want viewers, and I'm really interested in hearing what had you pursue after a successful ADHD coaching career and podcast, a new degree, a new podcast. Talk to me.
Well, I credit my ADHD diagnosis with my going back to school at all, because I feel like I never would have had the confidence to go and pursue a graduate degree. I did not do well in school. And obviously I was undiagnosed at the time, but I dropped out of university. I dropped out of high school and had to go back. So I had a very, storied career in terms of academia. And I feel like I always believed I was stupid until I was diagnosed with ADHD. Even though there was overwhelming evidence to the contrary, I had run businesses, I had been a coach, I had written a book, like all of these things that I had done that were obviously like on paper were success, were measures of success. I always sort of felt like that imposter syndrome, and I always felt like I was inherently dumb and fooling people. And it wasn't until I was able to really reframe my intellect, my brain, my love of learning, that through my ADHD diagnosis, that I even decided to go back to school at all. So this is like crazy, new for me.
Sure.
In terms of being back in a classroom. And it's been really, I love it. Like, it's been really great knowing what I know now about my brain to be able to go back and do it again.
I love it. So true ADHD brain here, wanting to get to the end before we even talk about the details leading up to it, right? You know nothing about that. So you got diagnosed at 45. How did that occur for you?
Actually, my therapist was diagnosed after her middle schooler was diagnosed with ADHD, but I didn't know this. This was like her own personal journey. But I think, once you're diagnosed with ADHD, you start looking around at all the people in your life and you're like, yep, you have it. Yep, you have it, as you know, with your family, right? So she started gently suggesting to me that I might look into it. And I was immediately dismissive. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not hyperactive. Like I was kind of insulted at this idea that she even thought I had this. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't bother researching. I was like, maybe, but like, how does that affect my life? I don't know. And then the pandemic happened and I had like a full-on implosion. I just was really, really struggling with my kids at home. My husband was at home. I was now the teacher, the chef, and also trying to run my business remotely. And, like all of us, we were really, really struggling. And I felt like I just couldn't accomplish anything. And I was trying to explain to her this idea of like waiting mode, and how I would just like didn't know if I was going to be interrupted at any time by my kids being home. And I just was like, I can't concentrate. I just feel like I'm sitting around waiting for somebody to interrupt me and I'm not getting anything done. And that's where she was like, really, you need to look into ADHD. And I still didn't really know how it related to this, right? Like I didn't attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is not something a lot of people resonate with, especially women. So I did a self test on Attitude Magazine's website, and it was for a general one for adults. And I think I've scored maybe like 50%. It was very like borderline. I was like, this doesn't really tell me much, because a lot of it was about like, do you feel like you are, a lot of those DSM questions, like, do you feel like you're run by a motor or you can't sit still? And I didn't really think of myself as in those terms. And then I took the Sarah Solden test specifically for women, and I aced it. It was like my whole life flashed before my eyes, because her test really gets to a lot of the like shame that we hold around some of our behaviors. And she's really talking about, those questions like, are you terrified at the idea of somebody showing up at your house unannounced, right? Where you're like, wait, that's ADHD? Wait, what? Like, are you overwhelmed at a grocery store? Where it was like, just like all of a sudden,
too much stimulation.
Right? Yeah. It was like all of a sudden, just felt like all of these random struggles that I had had over the course of my life all suddenly were, coming back to ADHD in a way that like still to this day gives me goosebumps to think about, like how just that feeling of like, this explains everything. Yeah. So, but basically I'm a pandemic diagnosis. Like I think a lot of us got diagnosed during that time, right? Yeah.
Totally. So you at 45 got diagnosed, and it's fascinating and apropos. You start a podcast, Women in ADHD, right? And you are a woman who's a late diagnosis.
Well, I started the podcast before I was even officially diagnosed, which I don't like tell a lot of people this, but I started the podcast like in the time between when I was self-diagnosed and when I was still awaiting my official diagnosis. And I just was like, I want to know if this has been, if other women have had this profound experience. And, I really just wanted an excuse to talk to other people and interview other women. And I was like, I need a platform. So I might as well start a podcast. I had no platform at all at that point, and was just like, started the podcast as an excuse to reach out to other women. It was completely self-serving. And then but there was a part of me that was like, if I don't get diagnosed, what am I going to do? I've already started this podcast, which feels very ADHD.
You be an ADHD advocate, which you are.
Right.
Yeah. So you get the diagnosis, and you say that the awareness piece has gotten you to where you are in getting a master's in counseling, mental health counseling. So what awareness have you acquired since the diagnosis?
Gosh. I think as a coach, there was always a part of me that was really interested in becoming a therapist. I think there's so much overlap. And I also feel like there's so much benefit for somebody with ADHD to have a combination of coaching and therapy. I feel like the two modalities really work well together. And so as a coach, I always felt like I was treading into territory where I was like, is this unethical? Do I have the right training? Right? Like a lot of those questions that came as a coach. So I had always kind of wanted to pursue therapy, but never felt like I could go back and get a master's. And I was just like, it's not for me. And then I started having a lot of coaching clients with ADHD talking about how they had a negative experience in therapy, or how they felt like, a lot of the time with ADHD, there's that feeling of like, I don't want to talk about my past. I want to know like, now what? Right. And so I feel like there's ways in which we need to do both, or that they really are intrinsically linked. And I also had a lot of clients, or a lot of women, reach out asking if I could recommend therapists who not only understood what ADHD looks like in adulthood and in girls and women, but just like understand how profound the diagnosis in adulthood can be, like how life-changing it can be for adults. So that's where I was like, I just want to increase this number by one. So that's what kind of prompted me to go back to school.
Okay. So Besides you getting that confidence now to go back to school and having the intrinsic motivation and data to say women need this extra help, because not everyone who is a therapist understands ADHD. And that's hard for people to understand too, right?
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things I noticed through my own life and also talking to so many women through the podcast was how many of us are diagnosed with depression and anxiety leading up to an ADHD diagnosis. And I feel like depression is something, our experience with depression is unique and very different from how clinicians view it and how clinicians treat it. And that was something, that was a conversation I was having with a lot. And I'm now realizing in the training, in this, going back to grad school, how I have a lot to offer in terms of this conversation. Like, I think there is a very limited view of what depression looks like in terms of, just the clinical diagnosis. And I feel like our experience as neurodivergents is very, very different. A lot of our depression comes from frustration and executive dysfunction, not from malaise and despondency and a lot of that stuff. So that's where I feel like right, like I think the conversation really there's a lot of nuance there, and I feel like there are a lot of therapists, like you said, who just don't understand what it looks like or
Absolutely.
even how to treat it. Yeah.
It's funny because I actually I've seen lots of therapists over the years, and I was diagnosed with anxiety and dysthymia. And then I saw a regular doctor who was more like a pill mill here. And I was going to him just to easily get my antidepressants, which I do not recommend to people if you don't know who like your doctor really is at the core. Like, do your research. But he also diagnosed me with malaise. And I'm like, that is the complete opposite of me. I can't sit still. Like, I have to constantly be going, I am not tired at all. Like, what do you know about my mental functioning? And it's so interesting until you yourself, with the help of that therapist, realize that your symptoms over COVID were very ADHD like. It wasn't until then that you put the two and two together, and you said, you were defensive at first. And I also was very defensive even though this is what I do for a living and did for a living, I was very defensive about the ADHD diagnosis. My best friend was a social worker. She's like, I think you have ADHD. I'm like, what are you talking about? So there's such limited understanding of how it shows up for women compared to, as you mentioned, the kid in the classroom or boys. It's so different. And I love what you say about depression too, because there are some therapists out there that don't believe that generalized anxiety disorder or SAD actually exists. And they think that the depression that comes with that, really for people with ADHD, is, like you said, the lack of executive dysfunction, or the trauma that we've experienced up until now that we haven't been able to manage or understand.
Yeah. Right. And I think a lot of us too, like, I don't dispute the fact that we are depressed, but I think that there is a sense where it's like a lot of the question comes down to what is wrong with me? My actions are not reflecting my intent. And so therefore I feel sad because I'm disappointing people in my life. I'm disappointing myself. And so, yes, you are depressed. Like, there is a sense of depression there because we're confused. And that's where I feel like frustration is one of those emotions that really, really stands out to me as an indicator of the, what our desire to do things, the overwhelming desire to do things and the inability to accomplish them. And that's where that frustration, and I'm like, when that element of frustration is in there, those questions like, what is wrong with me, doctor? Those should be flags to any clinician that there is, like, instantly that's an executive dysfunction issue. It's not just despondency or how I feel like they look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on a basic level, every single human wants to understand themselves. And if they can't get the answers from professionals, then they become anxious and depressed and stressed. And they're going to continue to try to seek out answers until they try to figure it out or just identify as whatever their symptoms are as a human rather than the diagnosis. And I so appreciate how much you are giving back and continuing that lifelong learning journey to support women with late diagnosis or new diagnoses.
Mm.
So, yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. So, you have one of the top podcasts in ADHD, women in ADHD. It's at the 0.5% mark. Then you go and you say, okay, I'm going to start another podcast, the ADHD Lounge, as if that wasn't good enough. What was your reasoning for that? May I ask?
It kind of happened accidentally. So Alex Gilbert is my co-host, and she's a wonderful ADHD coach. I adore her. She was on my podcast and had done some workshops for me in my online virtual community. And we really just kind of connected, and we had been talking for a long time about creating a community, a coaching community where we could do body doubling and have experts on and do, kind of the social aspect of ADHD, which we know is so important, right? The social aspect of accountability and that hive mind,
C.
right? Exactly. And so we decided we were going to create the ADHD Lounge. And when we knew we wanted to have experts come in and we would do like a roundtable with these experts, we figured, well, we might as well record them and have a podcast out of it, right? So it was just one of those things that kind of happened as a result of our creating the ADHD Lounge. But it's been really fun to have a co-host. So it comes out twice a month, and there's one episode which is a recording of our previous month's expert in the community, and then we have a second episode that comes out where it's just she and I talking about whatever that monthly topic is. So we've done decluttering and relationships and health and nutrition, and we kind of pick a topic every month to talk about.
I love that. It seems like a lot of the things in your life have come out organically. They weren't forced. It's okay, I have this problem. I'm going to do some investigation, and oh, look, there's work that's being done. So let's do something with that work. Same thing with your first podcast. Same thing with the master's degree. And
yeah, I don't plan ahead very well. I really just stumble into things.
But you know what? It's worked for you. And I think that in general, when people try to force something for themselves because they have this idea that they need to do something because they're told that they should be doing it, or they have to create this thing for themselves, that's where you can really just get stressed out. So I love the fact that you found that there's a need and you kind of just eased into it and put one foot forward and let it evolve as such.
Yeah. I definitely follow the dopamine when it comes to these new ventures, for sure.
Okay. So what else is your dopamine saying then?
Oh gosh. I think at the heart of it, like you said, I really just want to offer help to this very, very specific population. I get how overwhelming and complicated it is to have this diagnosis. So I'm starting to learn in my own life, like, what are the things that have helped me? What are the things that I feel really I need the most, or what are the tools I've used the most, and how can I kind of turn around and offer that in a genuine way where I don't want to sound like one of those people who's like, I would do this for free, but it always feels like I'm trying to I just want to offer people resources that are helpful, right? And really kind of take away any of that stigma behind, like, there's a secret out there, and if you buy my thing, you're going to discover that secret. I try
overnight.
Right? Exactly. Like, I really try to hopefully offer really useful resources, in a way that benefits us both.
We were talking about some other unexpected symptoms or manifestations of women and ADHD, which also triggered you to go back and get your master's. Do you mind sharing that with our audience?
Yeah. So before I was diagnosed with ADHD, I was already a coach. I didn't become an ADHD coach after my diagnosis. I was already a coach. I was a health coach. And I was working with specifically with women to overcome binge eating, and had no idea at the time that this was related at all, that disordered eating was related to ADHD. It was just from my own personal journey as somebody who really, really struggled with yo-yo dieting and left diet culture and embraced intuitive eating, but also recognized that intuitive eating was really difficult as well. And so like I felt like I had had this niche working with binge eaters. And then after my diagnosis, I was like, oh yeah, I kind of had to call everybody and be like, guess what? We all have ADHD.
Oops.
Yeah, exactly. So that was my book, which I wrote in 2017, it's not written from an ADHD lens. It was written before I was diagnosed, but it's definitely, like, looking back, it's hilarious because I'm like, this is the most ADHD friendly book. And I'm basically talking about what it's like to have ADHD and struggle with disordered eating.
Yeah, let's put that link in the show notes if you're still selling that book
It's
out
still
there,
out
or
there.
people
Yeah.
can. Okay, awesome. So, for those people who have ADHD and believe that they might have some disordered eating to an extent, can you explain what that really looks like for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think disordered eating is one of those things that is, for the most part, promoted in as healthful eating, right? I think it's really difficult for us to sort through what is healthy. And, I think with an ADHD brain, we have a tendency to really embrace structure and rules wherever we can because our lives otherwise feel chaotic. And so diets and diet culture are really, really appealing for people with ADHD. I embraced every one I could think of. I was like, I wanted a magazine or an app to tell me exactly what food to eat and how much, and I would weigh it, and I would get super into calorie counting and
Mm-hmm.
weighing. And I loved all the metrics. I loved the progress. Like, it's like so
My
many
Fitness Pal makes it
checks.
so easy. Uh
Right? There's
huh.
so many checks. It's really, really appealing, but I think it very quickly, because we have a tendency to have this all or nothing thinking around food and a lot of things in our life, we tend to go into extreme behaviors really quickly. And balance is very difficult for people with ADHD. And so I think one of the ways it shows up the most in our life is around food. And most of us have terrible interoception, which means we don't really pay attention to our bodily needs. So we don't know
Go
when
to
we're
the
hungry,
bathroom.
right? We don't know when we have to go to the bathroom until we have to go to the bathroom, right? And we don't
Right.
know when we're hungry until we're starving. And we don't know when we're full. We'll sit down and we won't pay attention to, like, eating mindfully. And next thing you know, I've eaten everything on the plate and I'm stuffed and I'm miserable. And then, and so I think there's just a
Exactly.
lot there in terms of the overlap. I love Becca King, the ADHD nutritionist. She calls it intentional restriction and unintentional restriction, and kind of how,
Mm.
the way in which, like, intentional restriction is calorie counting and trying to, weight loss and all of our complicated relationship with weight and the scale. But then there's unintentional, like not paying attention or hyper focusing, or the way that our meds, we don't eat, and suddenly it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you start to
And you're
crash and
starving.
you need to eat everything in the house. And so we get into those cycles. So yeah, I could go on for hours and hours about our relationship with food. There's so much there. And that's why I think it was so crazy when I was diagnosed to realize that, oh, like,
Oh, wow.
right, seeing how
It
many
was
different
right there.
things, right? And not only that, but just like how many things about ADHD and how we function come back to our relationship with food.
Absolutely. What else are you noticing in your practice that many women struggle with related to ADHD that they might not realize is a manifestation of their ADHD?
I think a big one for me was motherhood, for sure. Like, I always want to go back to that version of me who had newborns and was sleep deprived, trying to breastfeed. And I was so overwhelmed and so, I mean, that's God, I just want to give that poor woman a hug, because I just feel like there's so much in terms of sensory issues and noise and sleep deprivation and just, again, wanting to do everything right. Like, I felt like I was so obsessed with like disposable diapers or not disposable or breastfeeding or formula, like all of those ways that I desperately wanted to be the best mother and felt like I was failing all the time.
That cognitive overload of decision making when it comes to
Right?
mother, and the mother guilt is ridiculous. I'm experiencing it.
Right. And it's just one of those things that, again, it's like there's so many elements of ADHD that come into play when we, I'm not only, I haven't even, haven't even talked about hormones and all of that, all of the crazy unknowns around, our cycle and emotional regulation. So it's just a really, really hard time. And I feel like that was a huge eye opener for me, just in terms of how much I struggled and how alone I felt during that time where I was like, is everybody like, because you're told like it's hard, and so you sort of assume, well, everybody struggles, right? And not really realizing that perhaps I struggled a lot more or in different ways that I wasn't able to communicate at the time. So I feel like that's a big one. And then again, I feel like a lot of women get diagnosed in their 40s or older, where they're just like, I'm not doing this anymore, right? Like, I feel like there's that sense of like, I'm not
Sure.
juggling this anymore, I'm not taking people's crap, all of the people pleasing that we've leaned on so much over the course of our lives. We get to this breaking point. There's some catalyst that comes along where we're like, nah, I'm not doing that anymore. And then it all falls apart.
Reached that threshold. Yeah. Right. Your cup is so filled with toxic negativity that you just say, F it. I am halfway through my life and I'm ready for more. Like, I don't need to take on your BS anymore, right?
Right? Totally. Yeah.
But also back to the hormones piece, then, many people in their late 40s are dealing with perimenopause, menopause. So then that exacerbates their ADHD symptoms. And it's just this like
Right.
crash, right?
Exactly. And then I think there's just so much gatekeeping in doctors' offices too, where they're just like, oh, it's just menopause. Just sit tight. It'll get better in a decade. Or, like there's just so few answers.
Well, thank you. I can't wait for 10 years from now.
Right? Yeah, there's just so much of that. Like, you just need a good night's sleep or drink more water. All those things we've heard from our clinicians that are so aggressively unhelpful in terms of, like you had said, like answering those questions in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what would you say, since you continue to grow and learn to help others? So it's been 3 years now since you got the official diagnosis, correct? Or 4 years, 3.5. What would you say you've learned most about yourself at this point?
I mean, one of the things I think I've been able to reframe is just my relationship with learning and knowledge. And like, I don't think that I'm stupid anymore, which is really nice. Like, it's really nice to feel that way and really feel it. And like we were joking before we hit record about the fact that people with ADHD gather certifications and degrees the way other people collect stamps. Like, it's just funny how I see that evidence of lifelong learning in so many of us. And yet at the same time, I think so many of us share that feeling like, because we struggled in an academic setting, that we weren't really like smart on paper, and so I think that's been a huge shift for me, which has been really nice in terms of how I move through the world and how I move as a mother, in terms, I have a lot more grace with myself in terms of parenting and how I am as a partner. Like, I feel like that has really affected how I move through the world. But I also feel like just that, having that grace with yourself has allowed me to really feel like the system that works for me is the system that works for me, right? Like, there isn't some secret system out there. There's no secret sauce out there. And so I feel like that's really been helpful in what I work on with my clients a lot, which is really like, look at the things you have going on in your life that work really well. Focus on those for a minute and start to look at like why those work and other things don't. And looking at things more like a puzzle than failure. and being able to have that more objective look at who we are and how, I think when you show up for yourself as somebody who's really, really intelligent and capable, then the things that don't work are no longer your fault. The things that maybe are working on, that you want to work on, or the things that you're struggling with suddenly become problems to fix more than they become as an essence of, in essence, just, oh, I'm such a terrible person. And so that has just been like such a huge reframing that I don't immediately feel like I'm the terrible person in the room.
Yeah. I mean, we hear all the time, like, focus on your strengths, not your weaknesses. But if you could stop fighting with yourself about the things that don't work for you and trying to fix them, this is what I'm hearing from you, and start focusing on what is working for you and make those patterns and lean into that a little bit more in your life, you're just going to be generally happier.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you say that you give yourself more grace and it's helped your relationship with your husband, your kids. Do you feel, I'm sure you feel happier, but do you also feel like that maybe has given you the space to perhaps, and I don't know if this was you, but be less defensive?
Uh, I'm just laughing because I had such a huge fight with my 16-year-old last night about this whole thing where I've become her punching bag. And I'm like, I blew up at her, and we had a lot of good conversation. I mean, I think that's one of those things. Yes, I do feel like I'm less defensive. I think that there is just such an understanding as to the why behind so many behaviors that it's much easier to talk through, like, okay, I call them like the highway signs, right? Or like I like to say there's like notes in the margin when it comes to who we are and how we behave, because now you can sort of say like, okay, I blew up at you. You can sort of say like, was I hungry? Was there too much happening? Was I overstimulated? Or like, was I trying to let something go and I couldn't, and then it built up and built up. So I think it's just a lot easier to now look at like, what are the road signs that I missed, or, starting to pay more attention to the road signs so that you don't get to the place of crashing as much as I used to.
I love the visualization. And when you say notes in the margin, I think of doing like when you're pulling out and extracting important information, rewrite the summaries in the margin. However, don't highlight, because you're going to highlight everything, right? So don't look at every single piece of the book. Just pull out the important pieces. We can't focus on everything.
Right? Yeah.
Even though we want to.
Well, and a lot of that is in hindsight too. And that's why, I love that phrase, this is information. I use that a lot with my clients too, which is like, okay, if something didn't work, that's as important as it working, because now we can look at something that, if we had a strategy and we went away for a week and you said, I'm going to do this thing, and you came back the next week and said, I didn't do the thing. That's really important, because now we can look at like what was missing, right? Like that is just as important information as if you had done it. So looking at things, again, with that objective lens, I think can be really helpful for us.
Absolutely. Not classifying it as good or bad, just information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Katy, where can people find you if they want to slip into your ADHD lounge or listen to your podcasts? or just chat?
Yeah. So you can find me at womenandadhd.com, which is my company for the podcast, which is also called Women and ADHD. There's some courses there. I also have another coach who's working with me who is doing some group coaching packages coming up. And so there's lots of stuff over there, lots of free resources over there. And then the ADHDlounge.com is where the coaching community is that I run with Alex Gilbert. That's a monthly community where we have weekly body doubling. We do weekly strategy sessions where we come together, figure out what our week ahead is going to look like. And we do monthly strategy sessions. Those I find are amazing. Gosh, I love those.
Yeah, foresight is hard for people with ADHD.
Yeah.
So to plan ahead in a month.
That's the thing. Yeah, exactly. Like I'm not much of a planner, but one of the things I really like is taking that time to really think like, what do I want to accomplish in the next month? What do I want to accomplish in the next 7 days? Can be even not, you don't have to spend a lot of time doing that. It's really just figuring out how to stop yourself in your tracks and do that, which is where I think things like body doubling and community accountability work so well for our brains.
100%. Now, I know you're not going to be able to come up with just one thing. Yes, I am labeling our conversation. So what is one thing or more that you would want to leave our viewers with as a strategy to support them with their ADHD?
One thing, huh?
Or two.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, the most important thing you can do for your ADHD is daily movement. Like, get outside, get your heart rate elevated. That I do that every morning, and it's a game changer. Like, nothing else I think is as important as daily movement. It amazes me how difficult it can be sometimes for us to do that. I feel like that is like the number one tip I can offer. But I'm going to slip a second one in there because I can't help myself, which is that. But again, it's just that idea that like the system that works for you is the system that works for you. You probably already have a lot of things that work for you in your life. So let's figure out what those are and let's extrapolate from those so that we can start to like see those patterns and work on everything else. But, you know, put down the self-help books and really start.
Except for mine, of course.
Except yours, of course. Just kidding. I wouldn't put yours in the self-help category, but like I think of all the different self-help books I read over the years thinking the answer was at the end of them. And there's really no secret answer out there. It's really just like, let's look at what we're already doing right, and which is probably a lot. You know, that's one of the things I get really frustrated with was how difficult it is for ADHD women to see how amazing they are. And you know, we've been told we aren't. So it's an uphill battle, but I think it's much easier to see in each other how extraordinary we are.
I love that. Just to summarize, stop scanning everyone else and what they're doing and start scanning yourself and see how amazing you're doing things, your log of awesome. So I think that's an amazing place to leave everyone. And I'm going to put your links in the show notes. And it's just such a pleasure to finally reconnect. Katy and I have been going back and forth since 2020. And because she has multiple accounts, I didn't realize it. But anyway, I'm glad that we're connecting a lot, and I'll see you soon at the International ADHD Conference.
Yeah.
We'll connect again. Thanks so much, Katy.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Successful with ADHD. I hope it helped you on your journey. And if you need any additional support for you or a loved one with ADHD, feel free to reach out to us at coachingwithbrooke.com and all social media platforms at Coaching with Brooke. And remember, it's Brooke with an E. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.